Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Jim Jones. I'm the chairman of the emeritus chairman of the Atlantic Council, and also the chairman of the Scowcroft Strategy Center. We want to welcome everyone here to this very important meeting, an event which will explore the nature of the Iranian opposition and why the Islamic Republic goes to such great lengths all over the globe to crush any opposition to its rule. As you know by reading today's newspapers or watching television, this event is timely, given the escalating tensions between Iran and the United States over the nuclear deal, ballistic missile proliferation, Tehran's threat to freedom of navigation in the Gulf, and the regime's support for terrorism and proxy groups across the region in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and other places. Iran's aggressive foreign policy is just as much a central element of the Islamic Republic's DNA as its suppression at home of any dissidents or opposition to its rule. It's my personal belief that the Iranian regime is both unwilling and actually incapable of reforming itself or acting as a responsible nation in its own neighborhood and elsewhere in the world. It thrives on confrontations, and it needs external enemies to survive. So it's for this reason that I believe it is fundamental that the American policy debate towards Iran take into account Iranian opposition groups and ways in which we can cultivate those who champion the rights of and the desires of the Iranian people. My own experience in dealing with the Iranian opposition is primarily with the National Council of the Resistance of Iran, otherwise known as NCRI. And my education on that comes primarily from people like Ambassador Link Bloomfield, who I'm pleased to see here in the audience, and who I hope can also contribute to today's conversation, along with a very distinguished panel that we have assembled. I wanted to mention Ambassador Bloomfield's work because he literally wrote two books on the history of the MEK, one called A Twisted History and the other one just recently published called The Ayatollahs and the MEK. And these books provide fresh perspective, at least from my mind, on the history of the MEK, and is, in my view, the definitive story of its origins. His findings on the group have informed the support that the group enjoys today from a broad range of current political leaders and former military and civilian national security leaders, both here in the United States and abroad. The MEK is but one of the groups profiled in the new issue brief by Atlantic Council fellow Borzou Daragahi. Beyond control, Iran and its opponents locked in a lopsided confrontation. I want to just share with you my own awakening, if you will, about the opposition. And it happened after I left the White House in 2010. And I was asked to give a speech to a group here in Washington on the Obama policy towards Iran. And I accepted to do that. And it was there that I learned a little bit about the opposition. Several months later, I happened to be in a hotel room in New York, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, my cell phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was some of the people who had formed this group that I spoke to a few weeks before, and they had somehow patched me through to Camp Ashraf, which was currently being attacked by uniformed members of the Iraqi army at a time when our own Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, was visiting Baghdad. I could hear the shots going off in the background. And the reason I was stunned by it is because in 2003, when we invaded Iraq, when we discovered Camp Ashraf, one of the things that the United States did through the U.S. Army was guarantee safe passage and protection to the residents of Camp Ashraf in return for complete disarmament of the camp. And the people at Camp Ashraf, roughly around 4,000 of them, did in fact surrender their weapons, and each one of them received a kind of a safe conduct pass, if you will, that supposedly guaranteed their safety. The U.S. Army assigned a series of full colonels as the liaison office, as the senior liaison officer to Camp Ashraf, and everything went very well. The residents of Camp Ashraf and the leadership was able to provide the United States with some very important intelligence on the Iranian nuclear program and other things that were of interest to our government. It was a very good partnership. When President Obama decided to pull the forces out of Iraq, our government spoke to the Iraqi government under Prime Minister Maliki and told them to take care of the people at Camp Ashraf, and he, of course, promised to do that. And as soon as the U.S. forces were withdrawn, began to authorize a series of attacks on what is now an unarmed camp of men, women, and children, killing and wounding quite a few people. And this was not our finest hour in terms of living up to our commitments, and a great number of former U.S. officials from all walks of life have since formed to give support to the democratic ambitions if and when, and hopefully when, the regime finally is toppled one way or the other in Iran. So what we're talking about here is a country that is really a sworn enemy of the United States, has been for a long time. I think this discussion that we're about to have today on the opposition in general will serve us well in order to understand exactly what it is, who it is, and what can we do to shape the future for when that time comes. So I'm pleased to introduce the panel and to invite them up to the stage for this important discussion. First, Mr. Borzou Daragahi is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and is the author of this issue brief. He's a journalist with long career as a foreign correspondent in the Middle East, Europe, and North Africa for Foreign Policy, the Atlantic, and the Daily Beast. Nader Uskowi is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and served previously at the Pentagon working at CENTCOM, focused on the geopolitics of the Middle East, and in Afghanistan working for the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. Jonathan Weiner is a scholar at the Middle East Institute. He has a long and distinguished career in the State Department, where he served as a special envoy to Libya and as counsel to the Secretary of State. And during his time at the State Department, he played a key role in helping the MEK relocate from Iraq to Albania during the Obama administration. And finally, Suzanne Kianpour, who will moderate the discussion. Suzanne is an Atlantic Council senior fellow and a foreign affairs and political journalist for the BBC, where she specializes in Iran. And I'm pleased to invite the panel on stage and look forward to the discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As the General said, it's quite timely to be having this panel, and we have a lot to talk about, so we're going to dive right in. I'd like to start with Borzou to tell us what inspired you to write this brief and give us some background and sum it up for us.
Sure. Thanks so much for inviting me here. I'm coming all the way from Istanbul, Turkey, just arrived last night. Excuse me if I'm a little foggy still from the jet lag. I would just like to tell one little story, and then I'll go into my the origin of this project, this mini project. I was in Northern Europe just a few weeks ago, doing a little bit of research on an Iranian opposition group, not the MEK, another one. I'm not being coy by not saying it. I just don't want to scoop my own newspaper by revealing who that group was. And it took a while to gain their trust. It's an ethnic opposition group. They've been targeted by the regime physically and in terms of propaganda. And it took, a few hours to sort of win the trust of this group, let them in, let me into their inner circle, and so on. And but once I kind of figured out the key to winning their trust, they were very open and very kind, and talking to me for a long time, recounting the horrors that had been inflicted upon them by the regime, the obliterating of their language, culture, the discrimination, inability to get jobs, the lack of resources that were invested in their area, the hatred they felt from the people in the center of the country, in the Persian-speaking provinces of Tehran and Fars and so on. The unwillingness to allow this particular group to sort of enter into the mainstream of Iranian political and economic life. And I was just sort of dutifully taking notes when all of a sudden he said something that just sort of startled me. And he said that, as bad as the regime is, what would be worse is the monarchists, because they really, really, really hate us, even more than the regime. I would take the regime over the monarch. I would take a sort of separate enclave over the regime, but I would take the regime any day over the monarchists or the MEK, because those people, they completely do not recognize us at all. At least the regime makes a little bit of effort, and so on. So I thought that was just an extraordinary moment, and it sort of illustrated. Came after this paper, so I didn't include it in the paper. But it illustrated some of the dilemmas of the Iranian opposition: weak, fragmented, out in the middle of nowhere, cold city in Europe, and really unable to coalesce with any of the other opposition groups, and unable to form a front. And it sort of underscored what has been a characteristic of the Iranian opposition to the regime since, I think, 1979, since the revolution. I would like to thank William Wexler of the Atlantic Council and Catherine Wolfe of the Atlantic Council for sort of in discussing and sort of brainstorming ideas for this brief. They were actually very helpful in sort of germinating this idea. And I think that I was sort of uniquely placed to, please. I was uniquely placed to do this project. I'm sort of a red diaper baby. My parents were like leftists, and they were Iranian opposition people. I was in that world since I was a kid, and we'd go to these meetings in Chicago and New York, and picnics with different opposition groups and so on, democratic leftists opposed to the regime in the United States. And I remember the discussions, the documentary films, et cetera. Just growing up, I knew what these people were about. I knew that what their faults were. And then as a journalist, I have covered the MEK. I've spent a night at that Camp Ashraf that the general described. And I have also been to Albania and met with defectors from the MEK when they describe what happens inside the camp. I've met with monarchists of various stripes and so on. And I've also, and I think this is a crucial element of the discussion when we talk about the Iranian opposition. I've lived in Iran when it was still possible for me to live and work there as a journalist, and have a very good familiarity with the reformists as well as the regime and the various stripes, the various brands of the reformists inside Iran and so on. And I think that now is a very interesting time to look into the Iranian opposition and sort of define what it is, figure out what its weaknesses and strengths are, and maybe come up with a sort of a vision for an Iranian opposition, not just in terms of the regime change advocacy that some people make, but just any healthy system in the world has an opposition. And Iran somehow has managed to get away scot-free without one. And I mentioned I lived in Istanbul and I live in Turkey, where recently there was an extraordinary moment when an opposition mayor took over Istanbul. And I think that was a amazing effort. It was not something that just came out of the blue. There was people who were organizing, they were out on the streets, they were working in tough situations to bring about this mayoral victory and challenge the autocratic tendencies of the current government in Ankara. So even when we're not talking about a hopeless dictatorship or authoritarian system, even if we're talking about a flawed system that could use change, even in that situation, a healthy opposition of some sort is vital and important. Thank you.
Nader?
Thank you so much. Thanks for the Will Wexler and Katie inviting us. Borzou has done a great, courageous job. Usually, tackling opposition is not an easy task for anybody to do, and I'm so glad that he has taken that challenge and produced such a great issue brief. Just few observations on the state of Islamic Revolution regime first, and then on opposition, and then hopefully we have ample time in the question and answer period to go over details. I seriously believe that the Iranian Revolution is an unfinished business. The uprising in 1979 was an uprising against tyrannical rule of the Shah and against corruption. 40 years later, we are meeting a regime which is tyrannical and corrupt. So in that sense, that whole process of the 1979 revolution is unfinished. Dealing with the regime that see authoritarian solutions to all aspects of social and political life inside Iran. Abandonment of the civil rights, abandonment of the rule of law. Both Ayatollahs, Khomeini and Khamenei, like the rulers before them, like the Shah and the Reza Shah, have been, we've seen the drastic, merciless suppression of dissent and dissidents. And the corruption in this regime is well above and beyond what we even experienced before that. It was, I guess, a couple of days ago, we just heard that Rouhani had written a letter to some other banking officials that they have just lost $1 billion in foreign currency that was earmarked for purchasing drugs and medicine for Iran. That's the extent of the systemic corruption, that the government can lose $1 billion in foreign currency during the time that foreign currency is so precious for the country. So I think we are seeing a process of gradual decay, both moral and political, of the regime in Iran. That's why I believe the role of opposition is so important. More than what Borzou just mentioned, because without a strong opposition, if the country goes into a period of decay and there would not be any meaningful changes to the way that Iran is governed, there's a number of things that can go wrong with the country and can last for longest time. I remember when I was at Pentagon, the president of Somalia came in for a visit, and all the ceremonies and all the pomp and ceremony and everything, and he gave a good speech, but if somebody didn't know that he only controls probably a couple of blocks around his presidential palace, they thought the Somalian government this is what happened when governments goes into decay and there is no opposition to replace them. So in that sense, I put the role of the opposition in Iran centerpiece of what's going for the future, for the transition of political transition in Iran, and for the day after, for the future of the Iranian state. Opposition groups, of course, can play major role. Let me just stay on a couple of points on that opposition groups with the limited times we have. In my belief, the center of gravity of the regime itself is the IRGC. Without the IRGC, the regime would collapse. I'm talking about from point of view security. So if that's true, if the center of gravity of the regime is the IRGC, how the opposition looks at IRGC is very important. We have two extreme approaches from the opposition to the IRGC. One that sees that's not that all of IRGC or Basij members are consolidated into the regime, and they see a good chance that they can turn back on the regime and join a movement, a popular movement to topple the regime itself, actually, or help transform the regime radically. With interviews I had for my current project for Atlantic Council on political transformation in Iran, I've done a number of interviews, and I see that a lot of monarchies, especially the Reza Pahlavi, is on that line. That he states that he has the power to bring in at least the body of the IRGC, if not the leadership of IRGC Basij, onto his side, which looks great, peaceful. We don't have to have a long fight. But what if it's not true? What if the body of the IRGC does not flip and come on the side of the opposition? Then you have MEK and other opposition that parts of opposition groups that believe that IRGC is the key to the being of this regime, and then you have to target them. There are even some parts of opposition that see any weakening of the IRGC as being in favor of the popular movement, even if it's through a foreign war or foreign attacks on IRGC installations. So there is a wide variety of views on that, which shows how fragmented and how ununited the opposition is. If the business of revolution is unfinished and has to be finished by bringing in a government that stick with the rule of law and bring some semblance of democracy to the country, then the opposition needs to be united. MEK has been discussed here, probably the strongest and the most organized opposition group in the country. They have, of course, gone through radical change of what they say is their political platform, from a heavy emphasis on social justice to these days on heavy emphasis on individual liberties and liberalism. When you talk to the monarchies, you don't see much difference between them and the MEK on their current political platforms. Yes, there are differences how to approach the IRGC and how to approach revolution, but you see basically the same. I think the main point would become that who is going to get the trust of the Iranian people, if any? Is Maryam Rajavi, is it Reza Pahlavi, or somebody from Iran, inside Iran, which I think is the case. You have people like Nasrin Sotoudeh in Iran. And I was just talking to one of my esteemed colleagues and saying that, hey, when Khomeini was in Najaf, he was really not known that much outside the circles of the activists who knew him very well, not to the ordinary young people inside Iran. As soon as he got to Paris and he got all the all the demonstration had started and all of that, he gained a popularity. So I would not discount the fact that the new leader of the Iranian opposition would rise from inside Iran, although both MEK and Reza Pahlavi are serious contender to challenge the regime, but they have to prove it inside Iran. We have to see if the Iranian people are going to be on their side. Thank you.
Right after the massacre of the MEK at Camp Ashraf that General Jones talked about, I was asked by President Obama and John Kerry to get them the heck out of Iraq. And as I looked at what it would take to get this opposition group out of Iraq, who had been disarmed by the United States when we invaded Iraq, it became clear to me that it was a very big problem, because if you were Shia, you really didn't want to take in people who the main Shia regime in the world wanted all killed. And let's be clear, the goal of the Revolutionary Guards was to kill as many of the MEK as possible, certainly all of their leaders. And they did so by terrorist activity that they supported in Iraq, and I have absolutely no doubt of it. It's a truth, it's what was going on. Well, the Sunni viewed all Shia as troublesome, and Iranian Shia as especially troublesome. So the Sunni Middle East didn't want them. In the West, you had them as labeled as a terrorist group because of the bombings they had carried out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in Iran. So Western governments, by and large, with all the refugees around the world, didn't want them either, regardless of whether they were promoting individual liberty, economic justice, women's rights, all of which was part of their platform at that point, since their renunciation of bombings in 2001. So the one place that took pretty much all of them was Albania, a country just on the edge of the European Union, which is Muslim, but secular Muslim. They had been under non-religious communist rule, very radical communist rule, authoritarian government for a long time, for half a century. Their basic idea was people should be free, people should be allowed to live their lives. These are human beings. If we take them in, we're going to save their lives. And that was the fundamental position that Eddie Rama, the prime minister, took together with the opposition, which is why they, the opposition as well, which is why they wound up in Albania. Albania would take them. They had to escape the Middle East and modern politics entirely because of their unique status. Now, what I learned in the course of working with them is that regardless of their ideas, most of them had been out of Iran a very long time. And they were increasingly my age, which is to say I'm no longer in the flush of my teens and 20s. When people pass me by in the street, I don't have people checking me out. They might check out my son, who's in his 20s and tall and got great hair. And similarly, the MEK may still have some of them may have great hair and some of them may be tall, but they're older than they used to be. And it makes it hard not only to be a revolutionary force, but to even be a strong political force. You have the power of your ideas, but you also may be considered to be out of date. Now, Khomeini was out of date and old when his revolution happened. And that gets back to one of the points you made, which is that the regime today feels an awful lot like the Shah's regime did. And it reminds me of the statement, history doesn't always repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. The voices in people's head of what they're used to in governance can persist for a very, very long time. And when you have a transition can go quickly through many, many different figures, or it can grab hold through grabbing revenue streams or other sources of power and hold on even when it's not popular. Couple last points to make about opposition. Very repressive regimes tend to be very repressive because if they allow opposition, the opposition will take charge. The repression becomes a necessity to hold on. If you're a Revolutionary Guard and way up in the Revolutionary Guard or even lower down, how do you know that you're going to hold on to your income, to your job, to your salary, to your future? Change is a threat. It's potentially a lethal threat. It's, at very least, it's an economic threat. So in governments like Iran, which have a strong revenue stream, you have to look to who's in a position to control and retain that revenue stream. And I think that becomes a barrier. The way in which I think that it's a pyramid with the apex cut off upside down. When you have that kind of structure, there's an awful lot of weight on that small cut off bottom of the pyramid. And it's very, very hard to topple it. When it does topple, it topples with tremendous force because of the physics with that kind of a structure to a society. So I worry about whether peaceful change is possible for that kind of reason. When I see the repression, when I see what the Revolutionary Guards have been willing to do on a consistent basis over decades, it makes me wonder how it's going to happen. And the last comment that I'm going to make at the outset is revolutions, uprisings are made internally. Foreigners can support them from time to time, but they're ultimately made internally, almost always. If they're going to succeed, they succeed by ultimately picking their own people. You can find your ecological niche and build on it, but you better have that niche inside. So I go with you in terms of thinking that the future of the opposition is likely to come from inside. Very often in transitions, it comes from people who are utterly disgusted with the government that they had been part of. And they make a symbolic leave-taking. And their political power derives from the fact that they were part of the system and have renounced it. And we've seen that pattern repeatedly. And they may not be an ultimate figure who makes it all the way to the end, but they can in turn embolden others to do that. And that's the pattern I suggest may happen here. But the regime is certainly not going to give anything away without tremendous, extraordinary, violent resistance. Thank you.
So on the MEK note, Borzou, in your brief, you mentioned that given the choice between the MEK, Iranians inside Iran would choose the Islamic Republic over MEK.
Repeatedly. I mean, I think that there's sometimes a kind of a methodological error on the part of current and former U.S. officials when they talk about the Iranian opposition. They immediately almost they reflectively think of the MEK, whereas in Iran, the MEK is widely considered like the Khmer Rouge, an extremist organization with a very dark history that is structured in a totalitarian, cult-like way that has very little credibility on the ground in Iran. And I think that what you were saying, Jonathan, about the age of these guys, and they're mostly guys. There's no children at the camp because they're not allowed to marry. They're not allowed to reproduce, and they're not allowed at this point to recruit. So it's not much of a robust organization in Tirana. They're losing maybe 10 members or so a month that leave the camp and go and seek refuge at the UN. I think of it. I think of the MEK as a humanitarian crisis as well, and I think I just personally, based on what I have seen empirically over the years, it's just a bunch of people who are. It's quite sad to me, and I think these people are victims at this point, and are very isolated, living in this kind of very walled-in compound, very structured. I did a report from Tirana for The Independent last year about the way the camp operates, talking to defectors. You take that with whatever you want. They are defectors, so they're going to have their point of view. But I think it's a very flawed organization in general.
So if they don't have the clout in Iran, then why are they being targeted by the Iranian government?
I think that's a really good question, and in my brief, I do try to examine that. At this point, they're not being targeted as much as being used as a prop by the government as a boogeyman to sort of paint the opposition as very dark and menacing. Because it works. Because if you paint something in Iran, if you paint something as the MEK, upper middle class people in the north of Tehran are going to be, we'd rather have the corrupt mullah than those people, is what they'll say. And so if that's effective. I also agree with what Jonathan was saying about the sort of nature of repressive regimes. They just sort of act very repressively because of their weaknesses and their brittleness. And resort to security options when it comes to everything, as Nader was saying. But I also think there's something else, and I think it's there's Ervand Ebrahimian, who's a very great historian and social scientist in New York at Baruch, I believe. And he writes about this sort of continuity, maybe uniquely in Iranian history, the fear of chaos, the broad tendency towards central state control in Iranian history over the last 100 years, the crises that emerge whenever there is a collapse of central authority, as has happened in the wake of World Wars I and II and the Constitutional Revolution and so on, and this sort of impulse on the part of state power in Iran and this trend on the part of state power in Iran to control every aspect of life. And that started under the Shah and has continued to accelerate. There's a good side to that, i.e. Roads and electrification in rural villages. And there's a really dark side to that, which is constant and ever-pervasive surveillance of every aspect of Iranian life. And just extreme repression that is perhaps born of a unique Iranian historical experience.
Nader, this one's for you, especially given the project that you're working on. So 70% of the Iranian people inside Iran are under 40. So they've lived, all they really know is the Islamic Republic. So what do the Iranian people actually want?
Well, they really do not want much more than other young people across the globe or in the region. The regime, unfortunately, has created an authoritarian system of government that wants to control their personal life, wants to control their social life, do not allow them to really be expressive in those areas, and also in the political arena, unless they are somehow are agreeing with the totality of the regime. And more than anything else, they want to have hope for future. One of the major themes that we look at Iran in the past few years is the hopelessness of the youth on the street in Iran for their own future. That's why you have the second wave of migration in the past few years outside the country among the youth uneducated, which is, by the way, larger than the original migration of 1979. Much larger wave of migration out, because there is total hopelessness for them. Revolutions do not happen because people are not satisfied with their salary, or their salary are not paid on time. Revolution happens if they have hope for future, not just for themselves, for their children, for their grandchildren, and that kind of a hope is what is going to bring it. Now, we have the negative effect of that in Iran. People have lost hopes on this regime. We haven't seen that. They cross that into hope for future because, frankly, they don't see any alternative that would bring that kind of a hopelessness for them for the generations to come. On MEK, your second question, let me just very briefly, I do not agree totally with Borzou on that. Iranian regime is not an irrational regime. When they try to blow up MEK gathering in Paris last year, they know full well that their own government, the Iranian government, was in work with EU, especially E3, the three European powers, to bring them on their side against U.S. administration, against Trump administration, against the sanctions. They are not as irrational, saying, okay, let me go and blow up these things. These two are totally two different tracks. We can negotiate, bring Europeans into negotiations, at the same time blow up a gathering with 3,000, 5,000 people, probably more, including dignitaries from around the world, including the U.S. dignitaries. They knew what they were doing. If they are doing that, and those kind of actions do not happen without express approval of the Office of Supreme Leader. If they want to blow up MEK gathering in Paris with all the implication it has, it means it's important for them to get rid of the MEK. There is no other explanation to that. It's not that the regime suddenly have lost their mind and they're working irrationally. Especially, this is not a regime that would allow such a action without express approval of the details of that by the. So I think the history of attacking on MEK and attacking on non-MEK radical elements, including the courts, and including some of the left radical in the original years of the revolution, it shows that they really care. They think that they understand that MEK is organized, and it's not just 2,500 people in Tehran now. I'm sure they have a much more larger circle of sympathizers, and I'm sure within the circle of sympathizers they have different age groups, because I've seen MEK sympathizers as young as in their 20s, and I've seen as old as in my age. So there is a wide group on that. So I think that's why regime is afraid of. If things gets worse, the most organized groups like Khomeini through the mosques in Iran, the most organized group, if things gets out of hand, can vie for power. That's what the regime is afraid of.
Yeah, I'd like to follow that up with affirming the last couple things you said, striking me as relevant. The MEK and the regime go back to the beginning. They competed for power, both when the Shah was in power and right afterwards. They were in there affecting one another and challenging one another. And the leadership of both have been around for a long time. So there's a generational continuity at that very senior level, which keeps this war going. I was very surprised at the aggressiveness with which the Revolutionary Guards and the militias they controlled in Iraq were slaughtering unarmed people. There was absolutely no question that they were doing it. They were going to do it systematically until they killed them all. We were constantly warning them, do not do this, do not do that, do not do the other thing, there will be consequences. The fact that they planned the attack in Paris is something that is surprising to me in a way, for all the reasons you've just articulated. But it goes back to what's in everybody's head, which is why, again, I wonder whether change will come from the inside, from somebody who's abandoning the government, from the next generation, thereby getting beyond these perpetual wars, which go back now, which go back 40 years. When you have an uprising in a pre-revolutionary situation, it becomes revolutionary, things can change very, very rapidly. Remember all the changes in the Iranian regime in its first couple of years. I've seen this in Libya, where you had a series of governments, short-term, constant change, and efforts to bring back a Gaddafi-like dictator, which gets back to what kind of government can Iran ultimately achieve if there is change in light of what they've now known for a century, with the centralization you've talked about, and the lack of diversity, lack of democratic decision-making and pluralism at the local level. It's a great question. How do you get there? That goes even beyond the how you get there to if you get there, is it sustainable?
So if change has to come from within, but you believe that hope is what drives a revolution. Change has to come from within, but there isn't hope in Iran right now, is your opinion. So we're not looking at a possible revolution, but is there a possibility of reform?
Within the Islamic Republic, I think the experience of the past 20 years, starting from President Khatami on, has shown that really reform, I'm not saying that defeated forever. I'm not saying that, because always reformist movements always can live and morph into different kind of movements in future. But on the whole, has not been successful. The response of the government has been as repressive against the reformists as against their radical opponents. Look at all the number of people from the second Khordad movement, Khatami movement, who are now either in prison or have been eliminated, or have been many of them in exile. many of them within your ranks as journalists these days, and all of that. I don't think that people are now paying that much attention. President Khatami said last month that even if he asked people to go to vote, they are not going to vote because they are they have lost their hope on the regime. Although a couple of days ago, he asked the people go to vote as their national duty in order to show the world that they are united. This kind of a disconnect, even within one person who's a titular leader of the reformist movement, show that the reformist movement is in general is in a state of disarray. I'm not saying they're finished. I'm not saying there cannot be a reformist leader rise up in the next few years in Iran at the height of Khatami or Mousavi or Karoubi. But at this time, at this moment, it seems to be a very disarrayed movement. I don't see much hope about reformism.
I think the biggest advantage that the reformists have is just quite obvious. They're there. Yeah. They're inside. Sure. They know how they have ranks that know how the bureaucracy works right now. They know how the system works. And I think that they would, in any broad opposition would successly draw them into a movement.
Absolutely true.
You know, and those opposition movements that and you hear it all the time, constantly say that these people are fake. These people are to me they damage their own credibility. Absolutely. Because you cannot, and especially if you look at the history of regime change in the Middle East. The disasters that come about when you pull the plant out from the roots, and what comes about. I was in Libya, and I was just there last month, actually, and the consequences of that kind of radical toppling. If it can be avoided, it's always better to have a kind of moderated transition period than to have a exciting revolution. Revolution, to maybe at some point in your life is a romantic term, but as you see what happens, it becomes, to me, revolution is like an earthquake, and not a good thing necessarily. So any kind of moderated transition is always better from a humanitarian point of view.
I have a question. Have you looked at the social media in terms of who the voices are of opposition who manage to communicate the best, the most effectively? The MEC spends a tremendous amount of time on its own social media activity. And
Monarchists are very active.
And I would love to see this discussion go to who's communicating what to whom and what messages are taking off and what
Sadly, I think
groups.
the social media sphere is just toxic in terms of the opposition. It's pollution, mind pollution, and the more I can ignore it, and what I do, all I do is put on my Twitter, I put ignore all unverified email accounts, and I never see their comments because I think that they're all just sort of automated bots and so on. Like 90% of the Iranian discussion on social media is pollution.
Does it cut through at all to the people inside Iran?
Iranians in general, and I see Negar there who knows this stuff better than me, but Iranians in general they're not on Twitter. They're on Telegram, as you know, and Telegram works very differently. You subscribe to people's channels. Its harassment campaigns are not as possible in that kind of structure and so on. So the Iranians are very active in social media, but not inside the country. They're not like big Twitter people, in part because Twitter is filtered out and so on, and not permitted except if you're the supreme leader. So that's yeah, exactly. Although he says that he's against the Twitter ban, publicly says it. So I have very little hope, and the people who have studied, who've put a serious study, and academics who have looked at the social media sphere in the Iranian opposition have found also some very disturbing trends.
So I'll end on this and then open up for questions. What do you recommend that the opposition groups do to get better organized and perhaps achieve their goals?
Well, I mean, I think that one thing that would be great for everyone, including journalists who are researching this topic, and for scholars and so on, is to have some sort of central repository where, and I mentioned this in the paper, where you can amalgamate who the opposition groups are. Who are the Iranian opposition groups? I covered the lead up and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2002, 3, 4. What was stunning to me about Iraq is just how coherent the Iraqi opposition was compared to Iran. You didn't have the same sort of intense factional infighting among the opposition. You had the Shia clergy party, the Majlis al-Alla of the Hakim clan, collaborating with the Dawa, collaborating with the Alawi, collaborating with Chalabi, collaborating with the Kurds. They were all friends to some extent, even if they disagreed on many ideas and so on. And there was some genuine cooperation, real cooperation, so that was a real opposition front. We don't have anything like that when it comes to Iran.
In fact, it's acerbic in certain,
Toxic.
If you put the political platforms, the current political platforms of the Iranian opposition groups, and I've done that physically, putting next to each other for about 20 groups, from MEK and Reza Pahlavi large groups to the Kurds and the Baluch, and to some smaller groups who are leftists or nationalists and all of that. Basically, the basic points they're making in their political platform is the same, is the individual liberties, rule of law, and all of that. So if that's the case, then they have to find a way, at least on 3 or 4 or 5 of those points, get together and form a united front. Without formation of a united front, the opposition outside the country is not going to be effective in Iran. Without that united front, the only groups that are going to be effective inside Iran would be when the transition period starts, are the people who are already organized. Otherwise, non-organized people are not going to have any effect on what's going to happen in the transition period. And again, I think that the main body of opposition will rise up from inside Iran.
I'm a very big believer in getting information out that is fact-based about corruption involving particular people and institutions, as you just did, because people do not like corruption. They resent it enormously. And the more you get information out on that set of issues, it tends to discredit those associated with the corrupt activity and thus weaken them and create the conditions for the kind of activity that you just talked about of an opposition forming collectively over the same issues. So I would emphasize for Iran the importance of continuing to get out information in both English, French, and Farsi.
Great, thank you. I think I'd like to start out with a question for Ambassador Bloomfield. Let's see, there you are.
You have a question for me?
No, I'd like to give you a question.
Okay. You're going to ask me a question?
Oh no, I thought you had a question.
I don't really have a question.
Okay.
I'll make a quick comment, which is that I want to congratulate the Atlantic Council for having an open conversation. As Chairman Emeritus of another smaller think tank, I've welcomed everybody into our doors, no matter what their views. And it's, I think, part of the glory of this town that you can, in a civil way, put the facts on the table, perhaps have different facts, but open it up the conversation. I think we need that. I think we need a lot of other things, but that would be more of a comment than a question. But this is well done. Thank you.
Barbara?
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks so much. Barbara Slavin, I direct the Future of Iran initiative here at the Atlantic Council. And Borzou, I have to commend you. This is not an easy topic, and I think you've done a great job. 2 questions. One of the things that we as journalists have always struggled with is how is the MEK financed, given its shrinking base? Who pays for this? Who pays for these giant rallies in Paris? Who pays the Austrian students $50 to come from Vienna and fill out the ranks of this group? And I guess, well, maybe let me just start with that. How does it continue, given its shrinking base? Who pays for it? Thanks.
I mean, it's not completely transparent. The MEK itself says that it's self-supported by its own members and so on, you know, it's not clear. I know that there are a few Albanian investigative journalists who've tried to figure out. Thank you so much, General. Really great to. There's a few Albanian journalists, investigative journalists, who've tried to figure out where the money is coming from, because they've you know, bought these incredible properties between Tirana and Durrës in this beautiful hilly area, and they've purchased it, and everything they pay for, they're according to the people that I spoke to, everything they pay for in wads of cash, including like the internet bill, which is enormous according to the people that I spoke to. You know, there is speculation, but no evidence that Saudi Arabia is funding them to some extent. There have been some visits by Saudi officials and MEK leaders. They have been, you know, guests and so on, but I would caution that there's no hard evidence in terms of where that money is coming from.
And if I could, just one other thing I wanted to add. I love your comparison of the Iraqi opposition and the Iranian opposition. And I wonder if the success of the Iraqi opposition didn't have to do with the fact that, apart from Ahmed Chalabi, there was no real cult of personality around the leaders of these various groups.
There was no cult of personality around Ahmed Chalabi.
Yeah, whereas those who support the MEK are absorbed with the Rajavis and, of course, the Pahlavis. Do you think that's a factor?
I think that's a very interesting thought. No, but you know, I think that, you know, Jalal Talabani was a kind of a cultic leader, and Masoud Barzani definitely, and the Hakim, the Ayatollah Muhammad Ali Baqiri Hakim was a cult. Like the whole family is a cult, and you know, the Sadrists are also. So I don't know, maybe not. In Iraq also, you had these cult of personalities, but you had political groups that were cooperating with each other in London, in Erbil, in Tehran, even, you know, during these decades. Whereas in Washington, I would, you know, bet that there's really no cooperation between the Arab and Baluchi and monarchist opposition. I bet actually they hate each other.
And Barbara, we were in Tehran probably during the revolution, and then we had a cult of personality talking about Khomeini, the largest cult of personality in Iranian history. I don't think in itself is either positive or negative. It depends how that organization uses that or not. But we've seen on both sides of it.
The gentleman in the back.
Thank you. My name is Faisal Foulad. I'm Secretary General for Gulf European Center for Human Rights based in UK. We hear about the opposition, but you focused only on two opposition, which is monarchy and Mujahideen Khalq. We are working as human right in Human Rights Council session 41 since maybe 5-6 years now. We don't see these people working with us. We don't see their activities. We see other people which is really working very hard, which called themselves non-Farsi nations, Ahwazi, Belushi, Kurd. I'm agreed with my colleague. In the field, in Iran, monarchies and Mujahideen no exist. Thank you.
Negar? Okay.
Hi, Negar Mortazavi. I'm a journalist and I'm with The Independent. Hi, Borzou. Just a quick comment to add to what Borzou said about social media, specifically Twitter. There's also the language barrier. If you follow supposedly content in English on Twitter, this put out by Iranian opposition, it's not very representative of the population, and it's highly manipulated, as Borzou said, very toxic. So it's not a very good indication, specifically Twitter. I have a question for both Borzou and maybe Mr. Oskouei. There's a lot of talk about what the U.S. should do, but I want to know what you think the U.S. should not do, possibly, with the opposition. How, for example, in the era of the Green Movement, we heard some of the leaders, supposedly, or people who were active, trying to distance themselves from the United States government and the repercussions of what that could cause for people who are considered opposition inside the country. We've also heard suggestions from here in DC that, for example, the CIA fund labor activists in Iran and similar suggestions. So I want to get your idea on what does work and what also doesn't work as in part of supporting the opposition.
Just really quickly, and then I'll hand it off to Nader here. But I think that the U.S. should recognize that it is not considered a balanced, neutral player in this part of the world, and that anything it says is loaded, everything it does is loaded. So yes, we should talk about corruption, but it becomes problematic when an administration that is itself maybe not so clean talks about corruption in Tehran. When whereas, for example, you have Transparency International or some other organization that is considered more of a neutral arbiter. I think that would be helpful. But the U.S. should be aware that it is considered a very controversial force in this part of the world.
Anti-regime movements go through different phases. At the current phase, which is not a pre-revolutionary or pre-regime change phase in Iran, I think it's is not smart policy for the U.S. government or for any foreign governments, for that matter, to side with any particular groups within the opposition, because that would, in the long run, would isolate that country from the broader spectrum of the opposition groups. But the phases change. You come to a phase of pre-revolutionary things that opposition needs to have some kind of a support, at least moral, from the same countries that they didn't want to have them prior to that. Again, Ayatollah Khomeini is a very good example. Khomeini, when he was in Najaf, it was at least on the surface, that I'm not going to accept any foreign supports. The day he landed in Neauphle-Château in France, and then the Guadeloupe meetings after that, at least the tacit support he got from the Europeans and to some extent the US was a key factor inside Iran for the people to say, okay, this guy has not only has a base inside Iran, but also has a backing of the major powers, and he helped them very much. He became a totally different personality after that. So it really depends on on where we are standing at this time. Extreme malpractice politically for the government, for the U.S. government to side with specific opposition groups.
Johnson, do you have anything to add an input to that?
I certainly agree that the United States should be staying out of internal Iranian politics. Anything that the United States does in connection with internal Iranian politics is likely to be counterproductive at best. It shouldn't do it. I think it's generally a good rule. But
on an operational level?
I mean, at any level, by rhetoric or anything else, sticking to facts is tremendously important for the United States government, particularly in this administration. The more factual the administration can be, less tone, more facts is very, very desirable. On the issue that Barbara Slavin raised earlier on MEK funding, the MEK was designated as a terrorist organization, I think 1996 or 97. If you're designated as a terrorist organization, your funds are frozen. So if they had gotten a substantial amount of money under Saddam Hussein in oil money, which they then converted from oil revenues into cash or savings. What they would have, any organization in that situation would have done is put it into a safe place with the various types of shell corporations, holding companies, separated away, and then when they needed it, move it back in for particular needs through trusted money brokers, through trusted people inside the organization. And all the work that I did on the MEK, I don't know anyone who detected particular movements of funds from particular institutions or structures. But that's the way it would have to work in order for the funds not to be frozen.
Let's get some from, gentleman in the back. I'll have you next.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intel analyst and a former diplomat. I wonder if perhaps the U.S. couldn't play a role here by coordinating the sane opposition forces and having them do something simple like draft a notional constitution, for example. And also, isn't there room for us to take over a major part of the information space? I mean, we have human intelligence and signals intelligence with a fine degree of granularity, knowing which mullahs have 3 girlfriends and who lives in a house 10 times bigger than his salary. And that kind of stuff could be rebroadcast back into Iran in multiple languages, rather than just gathering it, as you mentioned. I mean, it's really a potent weapon taking over the information space. So aren't those two things we could do?
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to distinguish between the gathering and dissemination of factual information, which I'm always in support of. Generally speaking, sunlight is the best disinfectant. People do not like corruption in any culture, anywhere. It's an incredibly potent weapon to put out truthful information about bad behavior by elites in any country, if it's fact-based. The United States is at best a controversial messenger right now, so any information that were to be accumulated and then disseminated would have to be validated by independent people, in my opinion. The United States cannot play a role in the internal politics of Iran right now that would be constructive for all the reasons any of us can think of. But the dissemination of factual information is of tremendous importance. I think it's a tool that is not overused by the United States. I think it's a tool that is generally underused by the United States. I believe it's a tool that was underused by the United States during the Obama administration. It is a tool that was underused by the United States during the Clinton administration. I can't speak to the administrations I haven't been part of, but at least in those two, we had information we did not get out, which if it had gotten out, would have been to the benefit of U.S. National security and foreign policy, because it was truthful and because it was corrosive in terms of what it had to say about some of the foreign actors we gathered information on. Of course, the system tends to just guard what's in the system and keep it there, and that creates difficult problems, but it can be done. It requires effort. It has to be credible, truthful, and information that can be independently validated on the outside.
And that
Thank you.
information still classified?
It has to be declassified in order to, in some shape or form, but you don't have to. You can segregate information from sources and methods and still talk about methods for validation.
So why wouldn't they?
Because governments lack imagination, creativity, drive. They're beset by turfism, but they're beset by turfism. Small agendas, people looking at what's in front of their desk, not invented here, didn't do this yesterday, and conflicting policies.
I would just say, just stepping back one little bit, you know,
for starters,
I covered the, a lot of countries. I covered Algeria, and no one expected that people would, turn little protests about Bouteflika running for a 5th term into a, massive nationwide uprising that is continuing to roil the country and so on. And I would say that, Iran, like Algeria, like Egypt, like Iraq, has its own history. Iranians have been struggling. The fight for democracy and liberty in Iran is 115 years old. It has gone in fits and starts. It has gone backward and forward. It is an Iranian struggle. And we as Americans should not delude ourselves into thinking that we have a level of control that we don't have, and that maybe the money that would be spent on such an intelligence gathering and disseminating operation would be better spent on just improving the schools and highways and bridges and airports here in the United States.
So these three gentlemen have been waiting very patiently, so let's do them in a group. Is that okay with you guys? Yeah, okay, straight.
Thank you. Since you mentioned that peculiar situation where Khomeini actually was getting support, some support from Europeans and maybe even from the U.S. when he was in France, but actually it occurred to me that there's a retired German politician who for decades was very high up in their intelligence and security committees in their parliament, who suggests, and I don't go along with this, but he suggests that you could see Khomeini's move back into Iran within the context of Brzezinski's overall concept of ringing the Soviet Union with radical Islamist regimes, and by extension Western China, as we see. Have you ever heard anything like this, or what would you say to this leading figure in Germany?
I mean, this is like a historical question about the origins and international support for the Khomeini uprising. And again, I don't think that the U.S. was I mean, you guys know this stuff better than I do. I don't think that the U.S. was really supporting Khomeini. I don't think that France was really supporting Khomeini. I don't think that the BBC was, as conspiratorial as conspiracy-minded Iranians tend to say that the BBC brought Khomeini and gave him a platform and so on. I mean, just how history happens. It's just a chance, and one in a million chance that some crazy guy mouthing off in Paris and disseminating his rants via cassette tapes suddenly becomes the leader of the country, and this is the reason why the Iranian regime is so paranoid, because it knows that that's how it came into power. Some crazy guy abroad ranting on TV or the internet. So I don't think that like I said, I don't think that international powers have so much influence in these sorts of things.
Hi, I just wanted to initially thank you guys for hosting this panel. Within the last 2 months, The Intercept released an article about the prominent Iranian activist and writer Heshmat Alavi, who was known for prominently criticizing Iran through Forbes and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. But The Intercept at least presents a lot of evidence saying that Heshmat Alavi is not even a real person, but rather a persona created by the MEK to sort of further a certain platform. And so I was wondering what you guys think this indicates about the MEK, and then how Iranian opposition groups influence discourse and even policy in the United States.
I think Alavi is back on Twitter, if I'm not mistaken. So Twitter stopped him because they thought it was not a real person. For him coming back on Twitter doesn't mean that he's a real person. I don't know the policies of Twitter, how it works, but he is very active on Twitter again. So definitely from Twitter point of view, who started this after Intercept article to ban him on Twitter, he's back. But I definitely agree with Borzou on this. Don't pay too much attention to Twitter world when it comes to Iranian politics. It's just
Telegram.
Yeah.
That's where the action is in Iran.
There are even articles still worth going fact check that this person hasn't really.
What it says to me is that the MEK is such a cult that they can't even allow one of their members to become a star, because the stuff he writes is witty, whoever is writing this stuff. So they give him a fake name and a fake identity because the Rajavi cult is so pervasive that they don't want anyone else rising up. It would have been so advantageous to them to have this as a real person and have him do TV appearances and so on, but no, it's Rajavi and no one else. Dr. Kadam here.
Hi. Thank you very much, Borzou, for a great paper, as always. All your papers are great. My question is not for you. It's for Mr. Weiner. Or maybe because I can always talk to you easier. But also, I think what intrigued me is the way you framed the reason why the Iraqis did not want the MEK camp in Iraq because of sectarian purposes, that they are Shia, and then they didn't want a group anti the only government, and that is Shia in the neighborhood. It's not that. What it is basically is that this is a group that worked with Saddam Hussein hands in glove. They were, as the archives of the Ba'ath Party showed, that they were part of the domestic calculations for the regime in pacifying certain parts, especially Diyala province. They were basically no different when the regime was considering their assets as the Republican Guards or others. Especially, as I said, in the 1991 uprising, which I took arms against Saddam Hussein at the time. That's why I'm here. So the Iraqis tried Saddam and hanged him. The Iraqis dismantled the Ba'ath Party and apparatus and all of the Republican Guards and all of the security forces in Iraq, both legitimate and terrorist organizations under Saddam. And they were Iraqis. So they didn't want them because they were part of Saddam's henchmanship that was going on for decades. Also, they didn't like them because there were other voices in Iraq that said, well, if you are allowing the anti-Iran group in Iraq, why don't you allow the anti-Bahrain, the anti-Saudi, and the anti-Syria, Jordan, and some of these countries actually harbor anti-current regime, Iraqi regime. And the Iraqi government didn't want to open that door or leave it open. Also, the Iraqi constitution, which we sort of imposed most of its articles, did not and still does not allow Iraq to have its territory to be perceived as a threat to any neighbor or any other country. And this is actually what was also the uproar about what our own forces, American forces in Iraq right now, the objection to it, and there people want to have a law to get U.S. forces, especially when President Trump made that sort of statement about why they want to use them. It created a trouble in Iraq. It is really about that, not that it is Iraqis are, especially the Shia of Iraq, they are on sectarian basis, didn't do that. Having said that, I do agree with you that it was completely unjustified that they were attacked and they were unarmed, but they were in fact part of the Saddam legacy, and we had no business keeping them in Iraq, especially in the years we were designating them as terrorists. Thank you very much.
I'd like to respond to that. First, my comments earlier were not about Iraq. It was about every other country as to why every other country did not want them. Yes, they were being slaughtered by Shia militias who were doing work on behalf of Iran. That is who was carrying out attacks against them. That was what I addressed. Of the comments you made, I agree with many of them. I don't agree with all of them. I particularly don't agree that they were a military threat to Iran after they were disarmed.
I didn't say that.
Yeah, but I just want to be very, very clear. They were not a military threat to Iran once they were disarmed. So what you had was the Revolutionary Guards working with Shia militias in Iraq to murder unarmed people. And that went on for a number of years, including the direct raid on Camp Ashraf, where they literally took middle-aged women and put bullet holes through their forehead. And I interviewed some of the survivors of that attack, and it was pretty gruesome. I think they had a former MEK person they paid off whose body they left behind, who had showed them the way. And of course, it was all filmed in real time by the MEK. So what I was describing was the situation where the Iraq government did not want them for all of the reasons that you've articulated, including the presence of pro-Iran people inside the Iraqi government, people who were affiliated or supportive of Iran as one of the elements at the time, and the other reasons. And it was my job to get them out And I was able to get them out despite the fact that the entire Muslim world, other than Albania, would not have anything to do with them. And we went country after country after country. Will you take 5? Will you take 2? Will you take 1? And the United States wouldn't take them either because they were had formerly been designated terrorist group, and DHS took the point of view that that made them non-admissible. So I was given an impossible job, and I was able to get every single last one of them out of Iraq. And the whole issue was so touchy that when we succeeded in it, elements of the United States government didn't want us to even make it public. We weren't allowed to talk about it. And it was pointed out inside the Middle East Bureau that it was a rare, complete success for U.S. foreign policy, and that we achieved our objective. And we weren't allowed to talk about it because it just upset the Iranians, it upset the Iraqis, it upset the French. It made DHS unhappy, so we just moved on. In terms of their future, it seems to me that the future of anyone in the MEK is up to those individuals to determine and not anybody else, just like the future of the people of Iran and how they move ahead from what is a repressive, non-democratic, and in many respects extraordinary regime has to be up to them. Foreign interference in any of these situations winds up backfiring. One of the reasons why Libya is now in civil war is because you've had both sides, 2 different sides in Libya have different sets of patrons. And if different sets of patrons pick different clients, clients get patronage networks. And once you get competing patronage networks, it never ends. So it's critical, whatever the opposition is going to be in Iran, that it look inward rather than outward. And if they unify, as you suggested, which I think would be a great idea, they need to do so amongst themselves without it being seen as a US or a British or a French colonialist event, sponsored event.
And
Thank
also,
you.
we know the groups that actually made those attacks. We know the groups by name. We know the personalities and their commanders that report directly to the Quds Force and General Soleimani. The Constitution of Iraq do not allow existence of a militia armed group inside Iraq that reports to a foreign country, but that's the reality of life.
Soleimani.
One question is the attack on them is completely unjustified.
Right.
As I said.
Right.
But the question is that they wanted them out because of sectarian purposes. It doesn't capture the real reason why the Iraqis wanted them
True.
out. As I said, they dismantled Saddam's Iraqi forces, and there is no reason why should they give preferential treatment to foreigners who worked for Saddam.
Iraqis were not giving them preferential treatment. The Iranian supported and commanded groups within Iraq were doing that, and Iraqi Baghdad government had no control over them. The control came from Tehran.
No. I'm talking. Look, these are two. Saddam used both the Republican Guards and other Iraqi security forces that he had, and the MEK. Iraqis had anybody who worked with Saddam or part of his legacy dismantled and taken out of the scene.
Got it.
And that is the reason why
Understood.
they just went exactly with the whole
Understood.
sweep. Thank you.
Let's try to get one more.
We'll do one last question right here.
Thank you.
Great,
I'm Hussein from Freedom House. I want to remind you that none of you answered the gentleman's question about why you didn't talk about the other opposition groups rather than monarchists and MEK, which was a great question. And my question goes to Borzou. I like your fantasy about, definitely people should always seek, you can't hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
People always should seek, I don't know, revolution, but reform. But what's your suggestion in a situation that so-called reformists, they don't want to reform anything? And the ones who seek to reform are in jail or suppressed or sent to exile.
I mean, first of all, I would just say to that gentleman's question, I didn't hear a question. I heard a statement, I mean, people here are not talking about the other opposition groups, but I do in the paper, and I think it merits more discussion, and like I said, cooperation with the Kurds, Arabs, Azeri groups, as well as the nationalists and so on. But it's a very fragmented environment, and they don't mix at all. And the monarchists view the ethnic minority groups, by and large, generally view them as a threat. They don't view them as a potential partner at all. At least that's my understanding. If someone has a different view, I would appreciate that. It's such a dilemma in Iran. I'm just a lone journalist, and the question that you ask about the reformists is a big one. I would say that that it's not fair to say that the reformists don't want to reform anything. There's many different stripes in the reform movement in Iran. There's many different figures, and as Nader pointed out, even like the top figures change positions on stuff with month to month, and that's a characteristic of the reformists in Iran, is that they're not really consistent. They talk about Habermas one day, and then the next day they're talking about their love for the supreme leader. And it's a sort of schizophrenic kind of movement in that sense. So it's tough to put a handle on them. It would be so great for Iran to have a Spain-like transition from autocracy to democracy. That's extremely difficult in the securitized environment that is contemporary Iran. How do we go about bringing that kind of change from abroad is a completely different question, and a much more loaded question. Do we take the perspective of a social scientist and look at this as a kind of case study and so on, or do we take the position of an activist and think about the how-tos and the nows and so on? So there's a broad discussion that it needs to start.
We'll be looking forward to the scoop that your paper has about the other opposition group. Do you have something to add?
Very briefly, one of the complicating factors for Iran is that Iran feels encircled by the Sunnis. And if you look at what surrounds Iran, you can see why they would feel encircled. And the Saudis feel encircled by Iran and friendly Shia. And if you look at the Saudi map, you can see that. And that feeling of mutual endangerment and mutual encirclement is one of the things that fuels strong national security activities on both sides and makes it harder for both of these governments to become more pluralistic, more democratic, and more open. I don't want to make them equivalent, but I'm talking about a pattern that impairs reform throughout the region. Thank you.
All right, well, join me in thanking our panelists.